Recently it came to my attention that PragerU has made a new video about capitalism and socialism. And due to my utter lack of self respect, I thought to myself, wow, wouldn't it be a great idea to go over this? So I guess before I get into the points made in the video, I'll just lay out my general position on this. I would consider myself a socialist in the sense that I advocate for sort of public democratic ownership and control over the means of production. Now, what does this mean in practical terms? Well, the sort of model of socialism that I advocate for rests on a few different pillars. So, for one, I would advocate for nationalizing certain industries that seem to not respond well to sort of market mechanisms and market incentives. So I think like healthcare would be a good example of this, where you just take industries like healthcare out of the market entirely. And then in addition to that, where we leave the market, I would have the government sort of exercise indirect control over these industries by buying up stocks in the competing companies through a social wealth fund. And then, in addition to that, on the sort of worker power side, I would advocate for like massive sectoral unions, like what exists in the Nordic countries, and sort of co-determination policies. So, like for example, giving workers like representation on like boards of directors, and like giving workers like employee stock ownership programs and so on. And then, of course, in addition to that, I would advocate for like very high tax rates to fund large redistributive welfare policies. Yeah, that's sort of like the broad strokes of the model of socialism that I personally advocate for, which is, of course, going to be relevant as I go forward to respond to the arguments made in this video. So let's just get into it.
There are many in the West, including many who should know better, who find it difficult, unpopular, or just plain embarrassing to defend capitalism. I take the opposite view.
So
We
brave.
should double down on it for a very simple reason. It remains not just the best, but the only chance for the least fortunate in the world to make life better for themselves and their children. And the more we see of capitalism's rival, socialism, the more proof we have that capitalism is the way we want to go. I've seen this over and over again, from my own childhood to my time as governor of South Carolina to most recently and most dramatically during my tenure as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. I grew up in South Carolina as the daughter of Indian immigrants. My mom started a small shop selling clothes and gifts that grew into a successful business. She showed my brothers, my sister, and me what it meant to live the American dream. As my mother's story so vividly illustrates, America is a country where people can find jobs that match their talents and passions. Some Americans take this for granted. The rest of the world envies it.
Okay, so fundamentally, her argument here is that sort of free market capitalism is better than socialism because capitalism allows people to start businesses and achieve the American dream. The American dream, of course, just meaning like allows people the ability to make decent lives for themselves. So I would agree with Nikki Haley that giving people the ability to start their own businesses to achieve the American dream, I would agree with her that these are desirable outcomes. However, I would disagree with her in that I think there is substantial empirical evidence to suggest that it is the sort of socialist redistributive policies that I advocate for that would actually maximize people's ability to do this, as opposed to the sort of free market capitalist policies that Nikki Haley would advocate for. So, for example, in terms of job creation, or in terms of small business creation, the economist Gareth Olds has done a lot of good work and through a variety of studies, has essentially found that different welfare programs throughout the US, like, for example, Medicare and food stamps, have been shown to actually increase the amount of business startups. And this is fundamentally for two major reasons. One, these policies allow poorer people to have a larger disposable income so they can save more for investment. And two, it provides people a greater level of like economic security. So imagine, for example, you're a poor person, you want to start a business, but then you think, well, fuck, what if I leave my job to then go start a business? And then if the business fails, then I won't be able to afford healthcare, and I won't be able to buy myself food, and I just can't risk that. Well, sort of having government policies that say, hey, don't worry, no matter how poor you get, no matter how hard your business fails, we're still going to provide you food no matter what. We're still going to provide you healthcare no matter what. Sort of having these policies sort of creates an environment wherein people feel more safe engaging in risky economic behaviors such as creating businesses. In terms of the American dream more generally, and I'll link the studies by Gareth Olds in the description. In terms of the American dream more generally, I think the best sort of general broad metric that we have for assessing how achievable the American dream is income mobility or economic mobility. Economic mobility essentially just measures the extent to which people are able to move up the income ladder throughout their lives. And it just so happens that the level of income mobility in a given country is heavily correlated to how much welfare spending that country engages in. There's a really interesting study that, again, I will link in the description that basically compares income mobility in the U.S. and compares it to income mobility in Denmark. And basically what the study finds is that before taking welfare into account, the United States and Denmark have equivalent levels of economic mobility. But after taking welfare into account, Denmark has much greater economic mobility than the U.S. because it spends more on welfare. So there is ample empirical evidence to suggest that if we want people to be able to live the American dream and we want people to be able to start their own businesses, etc., the best way to achieve these outcomes is the sort of redistributive socialist policies that I advocate for. So yeah.
Some Americans take this for granted. The rest of the world envies it. As governor of South Carolina, I marveled at capitalism's power to improve lives. Our pro-free market policies helped bring in more than $20 billion in investment and created jobs in every county of the state. Those jobs provide dignity and purpose. And as I often say, when you give a person a job, you take care of a family.
Okay, so basically her argument here is that free market capitalism is good because that's the model that she applied to South Carolina when she was governor, and as a result, South Carolina's economic record under Nikki Haley did very well. But that, of course, raises the question, is Nikki Haley's economic record as governor as good as she says? And I did some digging, and I guess not much to my surprise, this does not seem to be the case. So let's look at a couple articles. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, just highlight some key points. So in terms of unemployment, which is the main thing that Nikki Haley was bragging about, right? She said like, oh, well, I decreased unemployment when I was governor of South Carolina. I brought in new jobs. In terms of unemployment, this article says, despite Haley's 5 years of lavish economic development deals, South Carolina has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. The state ranks 45th among U.S. states for unemployment as of July 2015, at which time its unemployment rate was 6.4%. Incremental improvements in the rate of unemployment in South Carolina are likely attributable to general economic recovery and were on par with improvements seen around the country. Well, that's interesting because she was boasting about, how great her economic policy must have been because it decreased unemployment, when in reality it seems that the decrease in unemployment that happened in South Carolina while she was governor is likely not attributable to her policies, but rather a general economic recovery that was happening across the country, which is why the gains in employment, which were seen under Nikki Haley, were nothing sort of exceptional compared to the gains the rest of the country was seeing at the same time. So not great. And then in terms of income, well, nominal median household income in the U.S. has recovered to its pre-Great Recession levels. South Carolina's median income still trails its 2007 level. This suggests that Haley's efforts to reward companies with taxpayer dollars isn't trickling down to South Carolina's working families. Yikes. So it seems like median household income under Nikki Haley was completely stagnant, lagging behind the gains the rest of the country was seeing. Then this part just notes how under Nikki Haley, economic inequality between white people and black people was extremely high. This part sort of outlines how when she was governor, Nikki Haley aggressively cut public education, which led to a fuck ton of like bad outcomes for the state. This part talks about how under Nikki Haley, the healthcare rankings for South Carolina were one of the lowest in the country because of bad healthcare policy. And so, it seems like when you look at, more broadly, her economic record, not exactly something to brag about. Then this article as well, this article notes that under Nikki Haley, wages were not good. So a 2015 report by the Alliance for a Just Society found that 57% of new jobs in South Carolina paid less than $15 an hour, one of the highest rates in the nation and well above the national average of 48%. And then goes on to note how this is a deliberate result of Nikki Haley's policies, which like literally went out of her way to discourage unionization and so on. And then this part talks about like low quality of life. So like according to a United Health Foundation study, like quality of life in terms of things like drug deaths, preventable hospitalizations, and so on, are abysmal under Nikki Haley. One of the other important things that the other article notes is that a crazy disproportionate amount of the jobs which Nikki Haley brought into South Carolina were actually temporary jobs. She seems to be bragging about her economic record. If Nikki Haley's premise here is correct, that her economic record in South Carolina is indicative of the merits of capitalism, then supporters of capitalism are in trouble, to put it lightly.
During my time as the U.S. ambassador to the UN, I was reminded that not every country enjoys the same freedom and prosperity as America. More than 1.5 billion people still suffer under socialist regimes. In 2018, I stood on the Simon Bolivar Bridge at the border of Venezuela and Colombia. I watched thousands of Venezuelans cross into Colombia for the only meal they might have that day. I held a beautiful baby girl. Her mother told me all she wanted for her daughter was a future of freedom. They were one of millions of Venezuelan families whose lives have been destroyed by the country's socialist policies.
Okay, so again, as I said in the Steven Crowder video, I'm not going to deny that Venezuela was a country that implemented some leftist policies, that called itself socialist, and that utterly economically collapsed. The question, of course, is why did Venezuela economically collapse? And to answer that, there's a few reasons. Firstly, Venezuela's economy was largely dependent on oil, and so when the price of oil plunged, Venezuela's economy shrank as a result. And then, to try to get themselves out of that situation, Venezuela's government engaged in massively excessive levels of money printing, which led to hyperinflation, which tanked the economy. And then, of course, it didn't help that the United States then piled on and started economically sanctioning Venezuela, which just made matters worse for their economy. So I think it's fair to say that largely Venezuela collapsed as a result of the government's economic policy. I think that's fair, but I don't think it's fair to say that this somehow implicates socialism as a concept. Because nothing about socialism as a concept or about the socialism that I personally advocate for necessitates the excessive degrees of money printing which Venezuela's government engaged in, which is what ultimately sunk their economy. Yeah, that's what I'd say about that.
So imagine my dismay to find that socialism has become trendy here in America. American socialists claim they seek a more enlightened socialism, like those found in Scandinavian countries. But those countries are not socialist. They're capitalist and offer large welfare benefits. But ironically, to make their system work, they've had to repeatedly slash their corporate tax rates. Denmark has cut its corporate rate by more than half since the 1990s.
Okay, so several points here. So for one, I like the sort of the word games that conservatives like to play with the term socialism, because they'll say to like the Democratic Socialist movement in America, hey, you guys want to turn us into Venezuela. We can't do what you want to do, or else we'll turn into Venezuela. And then when the Democratic Socialists say, well, no, we're not trying to emulate the economic policy of Venezuela, we're trying to emulate the economic policy of like the Nordic countries. Then these same conservatives say, oh, well, the Nordic countries aren't socialist. The Nordic countries are capitalist. Well, it's like, okay, then by your definition, we are also not socialist. So why are you trying to say that what we advocate for will create Venezuela, which you think is actually socialist? Like it's this very strange, like contradictory word game that conservatives like to play. But to get to the more substantive points, in terms of are the Nordic countries socialist? I wouldn't say so, but then again, I think of socialism as something that exists on a spectrum, and I think that the Nordic countries are much further in the direction of socialism than, say, the U.S. or most countries in the world. And sort of the reason why I think it's valid to bring up the Nordic countries is because in terms of the sort of socialism that I advocate for, it sort of rests on a set of policies like sectoral unions, social wealth funds, nationalizations of certain industries, heavy taxation and redistribution. And all of these policies, while I would go further than the Nordics have, all of these policies that I'm advocating for as the basis for my socialism have been tried to some extent, in some cases to very large extents, in the Nordic countries and have worked out extremely well. Which is why the success of the Nordic countries is evidence of the sort of validity of the model of socialism that I advocate for. In terms of have these countries had to slash their tax rates in order to keep their system afloat, there's sort of two problems here. The first problem is PragerU sort of does this thing. They're doing it here, and they're going to do it later on in the video as well, where they sort of give this take of, oh, if a country had a certain policy at one point in time, and then they sort of moved away from that policy later, then that must have means that that policy failed. I think this is very fallacious thinking. And it's funny because these same conservatives will constantly fearmonger about the rise of socialism in the US. And it's like, okay, well, if in the US we had capitalism and now people are moving from socialism, by your own logic, doesn't this mean that like capitalism failed? Because I don't think that you're willing to bite that bullet given the fact that you advocate that capitalism is successful. So I think that's like a very fallacious logical jump to make. However, it also is not even true, like factually. So I looked at some OECD data. If we want to look at taxation on corporate profits among the Nordic countries, because according to her, like the Nordic countries have been repeatedly slashing their corporate tax rates. So based on what she's saying, if we go from corporate tax rates in the Nordic countries based on OECD data from 1985 to 2019, we should generally see some sort of general downward trend among the Nordic countries in terms of how high their corporate tax rates are. But generally, we don't really see that. With Norway as the exception, which apparently had a massive uptick and then a massive downtick and then is now kind of going up again. The rest of the countries have had some ups, some downs, some rises, some slopes, but in general, their current corporate tax rates are about what they've been more or less for the past like several decades. So her claim doesn't seem to be true. And then I thought, well, why would you look at specifically corporate tax rates, right? Like I mean, like corporate taxes are a very small percentage of these countries' overall tax revenue. So if we wanted to like assess this claim, wouldn't we rather just look at general tax revenue rather than just corporate tax rates? And so I did that, and it basically, again, completely does not support her claim. So if we go from like 1985 to 2019, like total tax revenue as a percentage of GDP in the Nordic countries has been like in some places it's risen a little bit and dipped and then risen again, but generally tax rates in these countries are about at what they've been for the past like multiple decades. So I hate to like sound like a broken record, but like just to summarize, her claim that tax rates in the Nordic countries have seen a general downward trend in the past couple decades is factually incorrect. It's just not the case.
Other democracies, including Israel, India, and the UK, experimented with socialism, only to abandon it, and only then did they thrive.
All right, so let's go over every single example that she just gave. So India did have some sort of socialistic model that failed pretty miserably. Largely, the reason why India's model of socialism failed is because they had a massively bureaucratic, cumbersome sort of licensing system called License Raj, which created massive economic inefficiencies and was very bad for the economy. So again, I think it's valid to critique this specific policy in India as part of the reason why its economy was poor during that time period. But I don't think that this is an implication of socialism because I don't think that like socialism as a concept necessitates this specific policy that India had that led to their economy failing. Obviously, I'm a socialist and I advocate for a model of socialism that doesn't include this policy. This is why, generally, my line of thinking is that socialism is a very broad label that encompasses a lot of different historical examples, a lot of different policies, a lot of different institutions, some of which have shown to fail historically, such as like planning in the Soviet Union or India's license Raj system, and some of which have shown to work quite well, such as the redistributive policies in the Nordic countries, nationalizations in the Nordic countries, etc. So generally, I'm of the mind that we need to look at the historical record and guide our model of socialism towards what has been empirically shown to work and away from what has been empirically shown to fail. And that's what I try to do. So yeah, I don't think that the example of India is necessarily a problem for socialists. In terms of Israel, largely the reason why their economy failed during largely the reason their economy failed during the time period in which they had sort of socialistic policies is because, like Venezuela, they engaged in excessive levels of money printing, which created hyperinflation, largely to fund a war that that was going on in the 70s. In terms of Britain, based on the research that I've done in Britain, so again, with regards to Israel, like, again, it's valid to critique this economic policy, but it's not something that's inherent to socialism. And then in terms of Britain, from the research that I've done, it seems like Britain's economy wasn't doing poor under its socialist policies. It was actually doing like pretty well. However, there was a sort of general global economic collapse in the 70s that Britain was exposed to and affected by, just like countless other countries, which really, in reality, had very little to do with any of Britain's economic policies. And as a result, the conservatives in the country used that collapse as an excuse to undermine and move away from the sort of leftist policies that Britain had previously implemented. This wasn't really an example of socialism failing in any way. Yeah, let's move on.
The results are in. Socialism, however you want to define it, has failed everywhere it's been tried.
It's funny because she says socialism, depending on how you want to define it, has failed at every try. But she only gets to this conclusion by defining socialism in a very narrow way that leaves out all of the examples where more socialistic models have massively succeeded, like in the Nordic countries. Okay.
A handful of elites sitting in a government office can never outthink millions of business owners and consumers making millions of individual choices every moment of every day.
Okay, so this seems sort of like a rehash of like the economic calculation problem, which seems like strange because this is very narrowly a critique of models of socialism where it's like you have economy-wide central planning, but that's not what I'm advocating for. That's not what most socialists in the U.S. are advocating for. So this doesn't seem like a very like relevant critique. But generally speaking, I agree that markets are very good at doing certain things in the sense that they incorporate, a fuck ton of decisions that millions of people make every day. So markets are very good at like gauging demand in this sense. I agree with that. However, there are certain industries, like healthcare would be a good example, where because of problems like asymmetrical information, consumers aren't able to make good decisions that lead to good outcomes. So, like for example, take like apples, right? If you bite an apple and the apple is like rotten, you can say, "Oh, that was a poor quality apple." You can immediately judge the quality of that apple and then say, okay, so I'm not going to buy an apple from this market again, which is like fairly simple, which means that good quality is encouraged in the apple market and prices are set at an appropriate level, like relative to quality. Now imagine the same example with healthcare. It's not very easy if you're, a regular person to assess the quality of a liver surgery that you have been given. So it's very hard for consumers in the healthcare industry to sort of respond in ways that make markets function efficiently. Yeah, that's what I'd say is the problem with what she's saying. It's like it's true for certain industries, which is why I'm not advocating for taking the market out of every single industry in the economy. But also in certain industries, this isn't true, which is why certain industries require like nationalization.
You'd think we'd have gotten the message by now. An entire generation of American adults are too young to remember the suffering socialism caused during the last century. Instead of teaching students to reject our country's history and founding ideals, schools should have a required class on the history and collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I don't think bringing up the Soviet Union is terribly relevant because the Soviet Union was an example of a completely centrally planned economy, which is not what I'm advocating for. It's not what most socialists advocate for. Again, this is just an example of like, was the Soviet Union like a socialist experiment that failed? Yes. But also there have been other like socialist institutions and policies that haven't failed. So just generally speaking, we need to look at the historical record, move away from what hasn't worked, like the Soviet Union, like Venezuela, and move towards what has worked, like, the Nordic countries.
Young people at least have the excuse of being miseducated. But what does one say about corporate CEOs who give in to social trends rather than standing up for a system that their own businesses and workers depend on? I'm talking about advocates of so-called stakeholder capitalism, a philosophy that retains the word capitalism but abandons its meaning. Recently, the chief executives of some of America's largest companies changed their self-definition. They said companies should focus on customers, workers, and communities. This is just politically correct nonsense. These CEOs know that's what successful businesses already do. It's what they have to do to survive in our capitalist system. A company that cheats its customers, mistreats its workers, and abuses its community won't be around long. Profits are what keep a business going and allow it to thrive. They generate the funds needed for more job creation. You don't need an advanced economics degree to understand this. So why are these CEOs so anxious to embrace this in-name-only capitalism? Probably because they think they need to placate the noisemakers on the socialist left. But that's a fool's game. The left is never satisfied. So let's
Okay, so few points. So for one, it's really interesting to me how she's both trying to say stakeholder capitalism is capitalism in name only, but then she's also saying that stakeholder capitalism is fundamentally no different from regular capitalism because regular capitalism also works based on like pleasing all stakeholders. So it's like very like it's weird that they don't see the contradiction here. It's just like a very strange series of arguments to be making. But secondly, I think fundamentally what she's not understanding here is the concept of internalizing externalities. So what people mean when they say that capitalism fails to internalize externalities is basically so capitalism works based on people capitalists trying to maximize profit. And the calculation for profit, of course, is revenue minus cost. And so the problem is when a capitalist takes an action, not all of the benefits of that action or possible benefits of that action which accrue to society necessarily translate in the form of revenue that goes to the capitalist. And similarly, not all of the negative negative outcomes of a capitalist decision, which may harm society, directly impact the capitalist in terms of the costs of doing business. So, like, what are some examples of this? So, one example is like providing internet to high speed internet to like rural communities would create a lot of benefits because it would make a lot of people happy and it would benefit a lot of people's lives. But because the population density in these rural communities is so low, these benefits don't translate into profit for the companies because there are too few people for this endeavor to be profitable. Another example would be like in healthcare. So like, for example, like health insurance companies providing everyone affordable health insurance would create a lot of benefits for a lot of people and for society in general. But those benefits don't accrue to the companies themselves in terms of revenue, so companies don't do that. Or insurance companies don't do that. Like another example would be climate change. Obviously, like polluting the environment harms society broadly, but that harm doesn't accrue to the capitalists themselves in terms of like cost. Yeah, that's the fundamental point here, and that's sort of what she's missing. Because when she says like capitalists are incentivized to work in the interests of their communities and their workers, like this isn't really true at all. First of all, capitalists are incentivized to pay their workers as little as possible because the less they pay their workers, the more they save on labor costs and the more profit accrues to them. And it's funny because the article we looked at earlier said that like over 50% of the jobs which Nikki Haley brought to South Carolina were jobs which paid wages of less than $15 an hour. So she says like capitalists can't just fuck their workers and get away with it. Well, I mean, would you not consider paying workers sub-poverty wages to be fucking them over? Because if you don't consider that to be fucking workers over, then I think you have a fundamentally broken definition. And if you do consider that to be fucking workers over, then your own experience as governor disproves what you're saying. And then in terms of like hurting communities, well, I mean, this is like not really right in a few ways. So like, for example, the decisions of a business might hurt a community in some like certain abstract ways that people don't really like notice, so they don't have recourse to like make the company pay for it. Similarly, companies can obscure the negative things that they do. So, like for example, like ExxonMobil knew about the impacts of its business practices on climate for years and consciously tried to prevent that from going public. Another example would be like, okay, so say like maybe your business practices harm a community, but not the community that your business depends on to remain profitable. So like say you have like town A and then you have town B across the river. And let's say town A decides to like create some pollution that fucks up town B. Well, that might hurt town B, that might be really bad, but people in town A don't care because they're not the ones being fucked, and those are the people that buy from the store. So like fundamentally nothing changes for the company in terms of their revenue. So yeah, there's just a lot of ways. Oh, and then there are certain industries where demand is inelastic. So like in healthcare, for example, people can't just say, I think that these health insurance companies, what they're doing and not giving people health care and, engaging in cherry picking and lemon dropping and denying people for pre-existing conditions, I think this is very fucked up. So I'm just not going to purchase health care. Like you can't do that because you need health care, right? So yeah, those are sort of the broad problems with what you're saying. Oh, and in addition to that, it doesn't address the inverse. So like even if I were to grant, sure, if you're a company and you do things that are actively bad, then people might like give you backlash and that hurts your company. But that still wouldn't address the inverse of, well, what if you're a company and you don't do things that would be actively good because those actively good things don't make you profit? So yeah, just variety of issues with what she's saying here.
Let's defend what works. And what works is capitalism. Until the unforeseeable shutdown of the economy as a response to the coronavirus, it was working better than ever. Unemployment was at a 50-year low. Wages were rising at the fastest rate in a decade. More women and minorities were working than ever before. Poverty was at a record low in America. Let's get back to that as quickly as possible. There's only one way to do it: capitalism. I'm Nikki Haley.
Okay, so that last point was very strange for two major reasons. The main reason is because if she's trying to make the case that capitalism is better than socialism, and as evidence for that claim, she points out that capitalism recently has been better than capitalism like before recently. But it's like, if you want to prove that capitalism is better than socialism, then you don't point out that modern capitalism is better than previous capitalism. You'd have to point out that modern capitalism is better than like modern, more socialistic models. But if you do that comparison, if you compare, for example, like the modern state of America with regards to the metrics she mentioned, things like unemployment, things like poverty, things like wages, more socialistic models like the Nordic countries do a much better job than like modern America. So yeah, that's like a very strange way to provide evidence of her claim. Another problem is that a lot of the like a lot of the success and the metrics that she mentioned that we see in America are the result of the more socialistic policies, which I know she would oppose. So like, for example, the Economic Policy Institute had this really good analysis that I'll link in the description to this video that showed that the reason that wages have been rising, because a lot of people like attribute it to like Trump's policies, the actual reason, in large part, why wages have been rising recently, in addition to a more competitive labor market, is because of a variety of different districts and states choosing to raise their minimum wages. And obviously she would consider that socialism. She would oppose that. In terms of poverty, Matt Brunig has a really good analysis that I'll again link in the description, where he essentially talks about how the reason poverty is so low in America is because of our welfare system. For example, in 2018, headcount poverty was reduced by our welfare programs by 46%. The poverty gap in 2018 was reduced by welfare by, I think, 66%. So like even the success and the metrics that she's pointing to aren't the result largely speaking, of the sort of policies and economic system that she advocates for. So yeah, that's I think that's about it in terms of her arguments. Um, Obligatory shout out to my $10 patrons, that being Alex, Daniel, Benny, Isocratic, Liam Dakami, Hate Corruption, CEO of Market Socialism, and Zero. Um, if you want to support me, if you like my content and you want more of it, like more, sort of exclusive content that I make, check out my Patreon. I'll link it in the description, patreon.com/mouthyinfidel. I write essays about the same kinds of topics that I talk about on YouTube. And yeah, so contribute to that if you're interested. I'm currently writing an article about Ben Shapiro's very confused takes on welfare policy in the recent stimulus bill. So, yeah, if you're interested, just check that out. And otherwise, thanks for listening.